The late afternoon sun bathed the quiet neighborhood in warm, golden light. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint sound of children laughing echoed through the air. Elijah, a young black boy with a heart as big as his dreams, walked home from school along his usual route. His sneakers crunched against the gravel path as he hummed a tune, his mind drifting between thoughts of homework and the basketball game he had planned with his friends later that evening. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just another simple day in his modest life. But fate had other plans. As he turned the corner near the park, Elijah noticed a man lying on the ground beneath a tall oak tree. The man's face was pale, and his breathing seemed strained. Elijah's heart leaped in his chest. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then his instincts kicked in. He dropped his backpack and sprinted to the man's side. "Sir, are you okay?" Elijah asked, his voice trembling. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, but he couldn't respond. Beads of sweat dripped down his forehead, and his hands clutched his chest. Elijah's mother always told him to stay calm in emergencies, so he took a deep breath, pulled out his phone, and dialed for help. As he relayed the situation to the operator, Elijah noticed the man's expensive suit, polished shoes, and a gleaming gold watch on his wrist. Whoever this man was, he didn't belong in this part of town. Yet none of that mattered to Elijah. What mattered was getting him help before it was too late. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. An ambulance screeched to a halt nearby, and paramedics rushed to the scene. Elijah stepped back, giving them space to work, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the man who had now become the center of his concern. "Good job, kid," one of the paramedics said as they loaded the man onto the stretcher. "You might have just saved his life." Elijah nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and pride. He watched as the ambulance sped away, its flashing lights disappearing into the distance. For a moment, he stood there in silence, wondering who the man was and if he would be okay. Elijah didn't know it yet, but his small act of kindness had set something extraordinary into motion, something that would change his life forever. The next day, Elijah was sitting on the front steps of his small house, flipping through his math textbook, when he heard the unmistakable hum of an expensive car engine. He looked up, his mouth falling open in disbelief. A sleek black limousine pulled up in front of his home, its glossy exterior reflecting the afternoon sunlight. The car door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he had walked straight out of a business magazine. Sharp suit, confident stride, and an air of authority that demanded attention. "Elijah?" the man called out, his voice deep and steady. Elijah blinked, unsure of how to respond. Yes, sir." The man smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "My name is Michael Harris. You saved my father yesterday. I don't even have the words to thank you." Before Elijah could process what was happening, the man gestured toward the limo, and another figure emerged. An older man, looking much healthier than he had the day before. It was the same man Elijah had helped, now wearing a grateful smile. "I owe you my life, young man," the older man said, his voice trembling with emotion. Elijah's mother stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and froze when she saw the scene unfolding in their front yard. The neighborhood kids gathered at a distance, their whispers filling the air as they watched the spectacle with wide eyes. Michael Harris turned to his assistant, who carried a sleek briefcase. He opened it, revealing stacks of neatly arranged cash. Elijah's jaw dropped. "I wanted to thank you properly," Michael said, his voice firm but kind. "This is $10 million. It's yours." Elijah's mother gasped, clutching her chest as she stared at the briefcase. Elijah, too, was speechless, his mind racing with questions. Was this real? Why would they give him so much money? And what did this mean for his family's future? But just as Elijah was about to respond, a loud voice interrupted the moment. "What's going on here?" They all turned to see Mr. Carter, their nosy neighbor, standing on his porch with a scowl. The growing crowd of onlookers murmured in anticipation, their curiosity bubbling over. Elijah felt the weight of their stares, the questions hanging heavy in the air. What would happen next? Would he accept the money? Could this gesture of gratitude bring more trouble than it was worth? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. Elijah's life was about to take a dramatic turn, one that no one in the neighborhood could have ever imagined. The air felt heavy with anticipation as everyone waited for someone to speak. Elijah stood frozen on the front steps of his house, his eyes darting between the briefcase filled with money and the tall, intimidating man in the expensive suit who had just offered it to him. His mother, still clutching her apron, took a hesitant step forward, her face a mixture of disbelief and concern. $10 million? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Sir, this must be a mistake. Michael Harris smiled faintly, but there was a seriousness in his tone. No mistake, ma'am. Your son saved my father's life. There's no price I could put on that, but this is a token of my gratitude. He didn't hesitate, and because of him, my father is standing here today. Elijah's mother looked at her son, her eyes wide with pride and worry. Elijah felt a lump in his throat. The previous day had been a blur of panic and instinct, and he hadn't stopped to think about what it all meant. Now, with the weight of this unexpected reward, he felt overwhelmed. I was just doing what anyone would do. Elijah stammered, his voice shaky. Michael's father, the older man Elijah had saved, stepped closer. Not everyone would have done what you did, son, he said, his voice warm but firm. You acted with courage and compassion. That's rare these days. Before Elijah could reply, the sound of approaching footsteps drew everyone's attention. Mr. Carter, the nosy neighbor, had come closer, his arms crossed and his brow furrowed. What's all this fuss about? Mr. Carter asked, his tone sharp. $10 million? For what? Michael's expression remained calm, but there was a slight edge to his voice. This young man saved my father's life yesterday. I'm here to repay him. Mr. Carter scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he looked Elijah up and down. Saved his life, huh? And now you're handing over a fortune like it's nothing? Doesn't make sense to me. The crowd of neighbors murmured, their curiosity turning into skepticism. Elijah's cheeks flushed. He could feel their stares, their whispered judgments. Why are they acting like this? Elijah thought, his heart pounding. He didn't ask for any of this. He just did what he thought was right. Michael Harris raised a hand, silencing the growing chatter. I understand how this might seem unusual, he said, addressing the crowd. But my family owes Elijah a debt we can never truly repay. His quick thinking saved my father's life, and I want to show him how much that means to us. The murmurs quieted, but the tension lingered. Elijah's mother placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Elijah, she said softly, it's your decision. Elijah looked at the briefcase again, the neatly stacked bills seeming almost unreal. $10 million. The number echoed in his mind, dizzying in its enormity. He thought about their small house, the bills his mother struggled to pay, and the dreams he'd always had but never dared to believe could come true. But then, doubt crept in. What would accepting this money mean? Would it change how people saw him? Would it change who he was? Before Elijah could make a decision, a car door slammed behind them. A woman stepped out of a second car parked a few feet behind the limousine. She was dressed in a sharp pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she carried an air of authority that rivaled Michael Harris's. Mr. Harris, she called out, walking briskly toward them. We need to discuss this. Michael turned, his jaw tightening. Not now, Carol, he said firmly. Carol ignored him, her gaze shifting to Elijah and his mother. This situation is delicate, she said, her tone crisp. We need to be cautious. Offering this kind of money, it could raise questions. Michael's eyes flashed with annoyance. I don't care about questions, he said. This is about doing the right thing. Elijah's mother stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension. What kind of questions? She asked, her protective instincts kicking in. Carol hesitated, her sharp demeanor softening slightly. It's just unusual. A sum this large, given directly, it could attract attention. Legal attention. Media attention. I'm only suggesting we proceed carefully. The mention of media made Elijah's stomach drop. He imagined reporters outside their house, cameras flashing, people digging into their lives. The thought made him feel exposed, vulnerable. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. I understand your concerns, Carol, but this isn't about publicity or appearances. It's about gratitude. Elijah and his family deserve this. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Elijah glanced at his mother, searching her face for guidance. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and worry. "Elijah," she said softly, "you need to think this through. Whatever you decide, we'll handle it together." Elijah nodded, his mind racing. He looked at Michael, at the briefcase, at the growing crowd of onlookers. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time, he wondered if saving that man's life had set off a chain of events he wasn't ready for. And then, a voice from the crowd cut through the tension. "Why don't we just let the boy decide?" It was Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down. Her voice was calm, her expression kind. She stepped forward, leaning on her cane as she looked at Elijah. "You got a good heart, Elijah," she said. "Trust it. Do what feels right." Elijah swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. He looked around at the faces watching him, his mother's, Michael's, Carol's, his neighbors. Everyone seemed to be waiting for him to say something, to make a choice that would either set his life on a new path or leave it unchanged. But what was the right choice? Before he could speak, Michael's father, who had been silent for most of the exchange, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son," he said gently, "whatever you decide, just know this, you've already made a difference. No amount of money can change that." Elijah nodded, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. Elijah's hands trembled as he reached for the briefcase, but just as his fingers brushed the cool metal clasp, he stopped. A sinking feeling swept over him, one he couldn't ignore. $10 million. It sounded like a dream, but something about the entire situation felt too big, too complicated. His heart was telling him to pause, to think. He pulled his hand back, his gaze shifting to Michael. "Can I have some time to decide?" Elijah asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his expression softening. "Of course, take all the time you need. This isn't about rushing you. It's about making sure you feel right about it." Carol, however, looked less pleased. She crossed her arms, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Just keep in mind, Elijah," she said in a pointed tone, "opportunities like this don't come around often." Elijah felt the weight of her words settle on him, but he nodded and stepped back. As Michael and his team retreated to their car, the neighbors began to disperse, their murmurs lingering in the air like a thick fog. Mr. Carter gave one last suspicious glance before heading back to his porch, muttering something about crazy rich folks. Inside the small house, the atmosphere was no less tense. Elijah's mother sat down at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together. Elijah could see the wheels turning in her mind, the worry etched into her face. $10 million, she said softly, shaking her head. "That's more money than we could ever dream of, Elijah." But her voice trailed off, and she looked up at him. "Are you sure about this? Are you sure it's the right thing?" Elijah slumped into the chair across from her, his thoughts racing. "I don't know, Mom. I didn't save that man for money. I just saw someone who needed help." His mother reached out and took his hand, her grip warm and steady. "And that's exactly why I'm so proud of you. But this is a big decision, Elijah. We need to think about what's best for us, not just now, but in the long run." Elijah nodded, but the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. That night, he lay awake in his small bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. He replayed the events of the previous day over and over in his mind. The moment he'd spotted the older man in trouble, the frantic rush to help, the relief when the ambulance arrived. He'd acted on instinct without hesitation. But now, everything felt different, complicated. The next morning, Elijah decided to clear his head. He walked to the park where he had first spotted Michael's father in distress. The bench where the man had collapsed was still there, but now it looked different, almost haunting. Elijah sat down and closed his eyes, trying to remember the exact moment he'd made the decision to act. "Hey, you okay?" The voice startled him. and he opened his eyes to see an older woman sitting on the bench across from him. She was dressed in a simple coat, her gray hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her eyes were kind, but there was a sharpness to her gaze, as if she could see right through him. "I'm fine," Elijah replied, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "You don't look fine," the woman said, tilting her head. "Something's weighing on you, isn't it?" Elijah hesitated, then sighed. "It's complicated." The woman chuckled softly. "Life usually is, but sometimes talking about it helps." Elijah found himself opening up, telling her everything: the rescue, the offer, the pressure, the doubts. The woman listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When he finished, she leaned back and looked at him thoughtfully. "You have a good heart, Elijah. That much is clear, but good hearts are often tested in ways that aren't fair." Elijah frowned, unsure what she meant. "Take the money," she continued, her voice firm. "Don't take the money. Either way, people will have something to say about it. What matters is whether you can live with your decision." Elijah nodded slowly, her words sinking in, but before he could respond, she stood up and began to walk away. "Wait," Elijah called after her. "Who are you?" The woman paused, turning back with a faint smile. "Just someone who's been where you are." And with that, she disappeared into the crowd. Elijah sat there for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. When he finally stood up and headed home, he felt a little steadier, a little more sure of himself. But as he approached his house, his newfound calm was shattered. Parked outside was a sleek black SUV, and standing beside it was a man in a crisp suit. He wasn't Michael Harris or anyone Elijah recognized, but there was something about him that set Elijah on edge. The man spotted Elijah and smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Elijah Williams?" he asked, his tone smooth but unsettling. "Yes," Elijah replied cautiously. The man extended a business card. "My name is Richard Kane. I represent a group of individuals who are very interested in your story." Elijah hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn and run. "What kind of individuals?" Richard's smile widened. "Let's just say they're influential. They believe your decision could have far-reaching implications, and they'd like to offer their guidance." Elijah stared at the card, his mind racing. Who were these people? What did they want from him? And more importantly, what had he gotten himself into? The tension around him felt thicker than ever, and as Richard Kane's unreadable gaze bore into him, Elijah realized that the decision he faced was even more complicated and dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Elijah's hand hovered over the business card, as if holding it too long might burn him. The name Richard Kane, printed in bold letters, felt heavy, like it carried a weight he wasn't prepared to bear. His instincts told him to be cautious, but curiosity lingered. What did Richard mean by far-reaching implications? And why did it feel like Elijah was suddenly a pawn in a game he didn't understand? "I'll think about it," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the unease coursing through him. Richard's smile didn't falter. "Take your time, but remember, opportunities like these don't wait forever." With that, he slid into the black SUV, the vehicle disappearing down the street as quickly as it had arrived. Elijah stood there for a moment, staring at the card. His mother peeked out from the doorway, concern etched into her face. "Who was that, Elijah?" "I don't know," he admitted, stepping inside and handing her the card. "He says he represents some people who are interested in what's happening." His mother's brow furrowed as she examined the card. "This is getting out of hand, Elijah. First the Millionaire, now strangers showing up at our house. I don't like this." "Neither do I," Elijah replied, sinking into the couch. "But what am I supposed to do? It feels like everyone wants something from me now." As night fell, Elijah's mind raced with questions. Why would influential people care about his decision? What was it about this situation that drew so much attention? And most importantly, could he trust anyone at all? The next morning, Elijah decided he needed answers. He walked to the nearby diner, where he knew Mr. Carter often had breakfast. If anyone could give him advice on navigating this mess, it was the old man with decades of experience and an uncanny knack for reading people. As Elijah slid into the booth across from Mr. Carter, the older man raised an eyebrow. "This about the fancy cars and strange men outside your house?" Elijah nodded. Yeah, I need your advice. What do you make of all this? Mr. Carter leaned back, his coffee cup in hand. It's a tangled web, that's for sure. You got money on the table, power players circling, and no shortage of folks looking to take advantage of a young man like yourself. My advice? Keep your head on straight, and don't trust anyone too quickly. Not the millionaire, not that Kane fella, and not anyone else who comes sniffing around. But what do they want from me? Elijah asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Mr. Carter set his coffee down, his expression serious. Son, sometimes it's not about you at all. Sometimes you're just the key to something bigger, something they want to control. The words sent a chill down Elijah's spine. What could be bigger than saving someone's life? He thanked Mr. Carter and left the diner, his thoughts more jumbled than ever. As he walked home, he noticed a familiar car parked a block away. It was the same black SUV Richard Kane had arrived in. Elijah's heart raced as he quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder. The vehicle didn't move, but its presence felt like a shadow he couldn't shake. When he reached his house, Michael Harris was waiting on the porch. His suit was impeccable as always, but his expression was more serious than Elijah had ever seen. We need to talk, Michael said, his tone firm. Elijah nodded, leading him inside. Once they were seated, Michael leaned forward, his voice low. I have to warn you, Elijah. There are people out there who see this situation as an opportunity. They'll try to manipulate you, to use your story for their gain. Richard Kane is one of those people. Elijah's stomach tightened. How do you know about him? Michael's jaw clenched. Because I've dealt with him before. He represents powerful individuals who specialize in turning human stories into profit. They don't care about you or your family. They care about control. And if you're not careful, they'll take everything from you. Elijah felt a wave of anger and fear. Why didn't you warn me sooner? I didn't think they'd get involved this quickly, Michael admitted. But now that they have, you need to be careful. Don't make any deals with them. If you want, I can help you navigate this. Elijah's head was spinning. On one hand, Michael's warning seemed genuine, but on the other, how could he be sure? The world of wealth and power was completely foreign to him, and every choice felt like stepping into a minefield. That evening, Elijah sat with his mother, the weight of everything pressing down on him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. No matter what happens, Elijah, she said softly, remember who you are. You've always done the right thing, even when it was hard. Don't let anyone take that from you. Her words gave him strength, but as the night wore on, the shadows outside the house seemed darker, the quiet more oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. The next day, Elijah found himself back at the park, hoping for clarity. But as he sat on the bench, a familiar figure approached. It was the older woman who had spoken to him before, her sharp eyes just as piercing. You're still struggling, she said, sitting down beside him. Elijah nodded. It feels like everyone's pulling me in different directions. I don't know who to trust. The woman studied him for a moment, then said, Trust yourself, Elijah. You saved that man's life because you knew it was the right thing to do. That same instinct will guide you if you let it. Her words resonated, but before Elijah could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Asterisk, meet me at the pier. I have information you need, asterisk. Elijah's heart pounded as he stared at the message. The sender didn't identify themselves, but something about it felt urgent. He hesitated, weighing the risks, but his gut told him this was important. As he made his way to the pier, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the water. When he arrived, a figure stood waiting, their face obscured by the fading light. Elijah, the figure said, their voice low and urgent. You've stepped into something much bigger than you realize. If you're not careful, it could destroy everything you care about. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. Who are you? And what do you want from me? The figure stepped closer, their expression grim. It's not about what I want, it's about what they want. And if you're not prepared, they'll take it all. The tension crackled like electricity in the air as Elijah realized he was standing on the edge of something monumental, the truth just out of reach. Elijah's pulse raced as he stared at the stranger standing before him. The dim light at the pier made it hard to read their expression, but the urgency in their voice was unmistakable. His instincts screamed to be cautious, but curiosity tethered him in place. "What do you mean, they'll take it all?" Elijah asked, his voice a mix of defiance and fear. The stranger sighed, glancing around as if they feared being overheard. "You're caught in the middle of a battle for influence, Elijah. Richard Kane and Michael Harris aren't just rich men with connections. They're part of rival factions, each fighting for control of the narrative. They don't see you as a person, they see you as leverage." Elijah's stomach turned. "Leverage for what?" "For power," the stranger replied. "Your story, the black kid who saved a millionaire's father, has the potential to inspire, to draw attention, to influence opinions. Whoever controls your story can use it to sway people, to build alliances, to manipulate public perception. You're the key to a bigger game, and they'll stop at nothing to make you choose a side." Elijah took a step back, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "Why are you telling me this? What's your angle?" The stranger hesitated, their gaze softening. "Because I've seen what happens to people like you when they get caught in this web. They get chewed up and spit out. You're young, Elijah, but you're not naive. If you play this smart, you can protect yourself and your family." Before Elijah could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He spun around to see Richard Kane approaching, flanked by two imposing men. "Elijah," Richard called out, his tone smooth but firm, "I thought I might find you here." The stranger stiffened, their expression darkening. "Don't trust him," they whispered before slipping away into the shadows. Elijah stood frozen as Richard reached him, his sharp suit immaculate even in the fading light. "It seemed you've been having some interesting conversations," Richard said, his smile thin. Elijah clenched his fists. "Why are you here?" "To protect my investment," Richard replied coolly. "You see, Elijah, I've been very generous, offering you opportunities, extending my resources. But generosity comes with expectations. I need to know where your loyalties lie." "My loyalties?" Elijah echoed, his voice rising. "I don't owe you anything. I saved your dad because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something in return." Richard's smile faded, replaced by a calculating look. "Perhaps, but the world doesn't work on noble intentions alone. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. And trust me, the choices you make will have consequences." Before Elijah could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Elijah doesn't belong to you, Kane." Michael Harris emerged from the shadows, his own entourage in tow. The two men squared off like opposing forces of nature, each radiating authority and menace. "Michael," Richard said, his tone dripping with disdain, "I should have known you'd show up, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Michael smirked, "And I should have known you'd try to bully a young man into submission." "Elijah's not a pawn in your game, Kane. He's got a mind of his own." Elijah felt like the ground beneath him was splitting apart. The tension between the two men crackled like a live wire, and he was the fuse. "This isn't about loyalty, Elijah," Michael said, turning to him. "It's about control. Kane wants to own your story, to twist it for his own gain, but you don't have to let him. You can stand on your own terms." "And what about you?" Elijah shot back. "You've been acting like you're trying to help me, but how do I know you're not just another version of him?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "You don't, but at least I'm honest about the stakes. You're in a position to make a difference, Elijah, but only if you play your cards right." Elijah's mind spun as the two men continued to argue, their words blurring together in a storm of threats and promises. Every fiber of his being told him to run, to escape this madness, but he knew he couldn't. Not when his family's future, and maybe even his own integrity, was on the line. As the argument escalated, a sudden noise drew everyone's attention. The sound of tires screeching and car doors slamming made Elijah's heart leap. A group of men in dark clothing emerged from an unmarked van, their faces obscured by masks. "Gentlemen," one of them said, his voice calm but menacing, "I think it's time we took control of the situation." Panic surged through Elijah as the men advanced, their intent unmistakable. Richard and Michael both froze, their rivalry momentarily eclipsed by the new threat. "Elijah," Michael said urgently, his voice low, "stay behind me." But Elijah didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Who were these men? And what did they want with him? The leader of the masked group stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "You've become quite the centerpiece in this little drama," he said. "But don't worry, we're here to simplify things." The air felt thick with tension as the masked men closed in, their motives shrouded in mystery. Elijah's world had just become even more dangerous, and he realized that the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined.